Okay, thank you, Hugh. Now, we've got 45 minutes. I'm quite tempted to advance my stress test, but let's first of all throw it open, because I'm sure there are some. I know there's at least one question. So let's see. Okay, how many microphones have we got? Have we just got the one, or are there just one? Okay, thanks. Can you just say?
Yes,
who you are?
From the University of Hertfordshire. Well, I just say to everybody, it's been one of the most depressing days of my life here, partly because of the extent to which people seem to be advocating control of the press through legislation and most particularly through legal means. And I'm encouraged, though, by Hugh, who seems to be most aware of the dangers of that. And I just wanted to ask the panel, I mean, on the one side, the PCC seem to be proposing something which is a non-starter, simply because you're going to have the same people hearing the same cases and sort of letting the press off yet again. And that's never going to satisfy anyone. I think the PCC has been a failure, not so much because of the code, as Max said, but because, basically they have not been stringent enough with the press, and because the press has been both judge and jury. But at the same time, what I wanted to ask the panel, in their heart of hearts, do they really want, and a question I ask everybody here, do we actually really want the press fundamentally to be regulated by the legal system, by the state? Is that really what is this such a crisis, so deep and so bad, that we actually abandon the fundamental civil liberty of a free press and give it over to the state? And I again and again today, there's been that underlying feeling and sense that that's what people are calling for. And I'd just like to know what the individual responses are to that. 'Cause I think this is a very critical time. And if we're going to be going and advising government on their inquiry and say, yes, take over the press, yes, regulate the press, yes, legislate against us, then I think that's a very depressing and very unfortunate result of this whole scandal.
Two parts to that question. Essentially, the first bit, I think, is to you, Jonathan.
The second bit as well, I think.
Okay, all right. Well, the first bit is... Okay, let's do the first bit first. Same people, same questions, judge and jury. PCC have been doing it for 20 years and manifestly failed. Why should we trust them to get it right this time?
Because that's not what's proposed. What's proposed is an entirely new body which would encompass an entirely new standards and compliance arm which would deal with the serious and systemic breaches, which is, I assume, what you're talking about, rather than the sort of routine complaints, which I think most people would acknowledge the PCC's dealt fairly well with over the years. But my main concern was about the second part of the question, because the premise, I think, was that I was in favour of sort of state or legislative regulation of the press.
I think that was aimed at the other three.
I think he'd misunderstood the suggestion that contracts would be legally underpinned, because, of course, that's about the civil law, and the whole purpose of coming up with that solution is to avoid legislation and state regulation. It's so that you almost have a backstop of the contracts to make sure that people are behaving and staying within the system, but it would bring all the benefits of the buy-in that self-regulation brings and all the benefits for freedom of expression that the absence of state regulation brings.
So that's your answer to the other three. So let me throw the rest of that question to the other three, which is essentially the argument that we heard partly from Michael Gove yesterday, and we are almost certainly going to hear when LEVESON delivers his report, which is what you're actually doing is sanctioning involvement by the state in a free press, and if not by the state, then certainly by the judiciary. Martin?
Well, I wasn't here for the rest of the day, so I'm afraid I can't respond to what people were saying earlier in the day, but I can tell you from my own personal perspective, from the group that we've been working with, that everyone is vehemently opposed to any sort of state involvement whatsoever in the press. And we've spent the last 6 months thinking very, very carefully about how to protect press freedom, how to create the greatest amount of publishing freedom, and how to create safeguards to stop any sort of state involvement. Now, I referred sort of an outline to it, but just to reiterate a couple of them. First of all, in the system that I described, anyone who's not earning substantial amounts, so 6.5 million a year is not a small amount. Private eye earns an awful lot less than that, from their publishing activities would not have any obligations whatsoever, outside the law. They can do whatever they like within the law, which is actually freer than the current system. Anyone over that, in other words, a large corporation, would not be regulated, but would have obligations to regulate themselves, so that they would have to have internal complaints and compliance mechanisms, and they'd have to be part of a self-regulatory system. That would be the obligation that was made to them. The only reason that there has to be any legislation whatsoever is because clearly, as we've seen over the last 60 years, when left to their own devices, the press say, we'll sort it out, we'll create a comprehensive system, we'll reform the whole process. And 4 times that's been said, and 4 times they failed. So the only reason for any sort of legislation is an enabling statute to say those are the obligations that are required of large publishing companies, and the legislation makes those obligations and creates an auditor just to make sure on an annual basis that the process is working. So
there is statute, but it's right at the back, in the background. Max?
A word on that?
Yes, go on. Yes, please.
Without being sort of rude, it's complete nonsense to suggest that if you have a statute that enables the rules to be enforced, that is somehow government control. It's rubbish. If you think about it, first of all, there is already the law of the land. The difficulty is enforcing it because it's so expensive, but it's there already, and it's not government control. Secondly, you have the PCC rules. Now, if you enforced both the PCC rules and the law of the land, all of the problems that we're talking about, or virtually all of them, would disappear. Now, how can enforcing rules which already exist, and in the case of the rules are actually the rules devised by the press themselves, because in the PCC, the rulemaking body is entirely edited, how can that be government control? What's actually happening here is that the press, or sections of the press, people like Mr. Gove, are fooling us or trying to fool us. And it's the principle of the stage magician. Get somebody to look at the wrong thing, and you can then get on with doing your secret trick. They've got us all looking at government control. There is no question of government control. Nobody's ever put that forward. The government don't want it. Nobody wants it. It's not the issue. The danger is not government control. It's want of plurality in the press, which means that 3 groups control virtually the entire press. And as a result of that, instead of fulfilling their role as watchdog and holding Parliament, the police, and people like that to account, it is more profitable for their shareholders to do cosy little deals which advance the commercial interests of those groups rather than fulfilling their proper role as the watchdog. And that's what's actually going on. And if you're worried about press freedom, what you want is a much greater plurality of the press.
But Max, if you come back to our friend's problem, which is not necessarily the state's going to control the press, but just think about your particular model.
Yes.
Let's say I am, and I will advance a sort of little scenario. I am, let's say, a sort of minor first division footballer in a medium-sized town somewhere, and the local paper, which has quite a big influence in that town, has published intrusive photos of me having a fling with some woman, even though I'm married, and publishes those photos, having obtained them through long lens photography, which is against the PCC's code of conduct. Now, am I right in thinking that in your model, I would go to my local and the paper, I go to the paper and say I want an apology, and they say go away. What would happen to me then? I would go to one of your local tribunals?
Go to the local tribunal, and the first thing that the tribunal would say is, did you inform the footballer beforehand, before publishing these pictures, to give him an opportunity of asking for an injunction to stop it, which, of course, had he known about the pictures, he would have done, and they usually do know. But if the pictures have already been published, he would then go to the local tribunal and invite them to impose a significant fine on the newspaper, which would hopefully deter them from doing that in the future. But the real answer to that sort of thing is prior notification.
And what if the tribunal, I've given you a fairly easy case because there's no obvious kind of general public interest, but what is there another case where there might be an argument to say this publication was actually in the public interest? Let's say this was not a footballer but a medium-ranking council official. And the debate is it in the public interest to know that he was doing something in council office, local government time, when he should have been working for the taxpayer? Who decides whether that's a public interest issue or not?
The adjudicator would decide. And of course, that's exactly the sort of issue that currently comes to the High Court. And you get a judge then weighing Article 8, the privacy, against Article 10, the freedom of press. But that would be exactly what happened with our adjudicator.
And isn't that, okay, sorry to interrupt, isn't that what our friend is worried? Isn't that the state intervention that our friend's worried about?
No, it's the law of the land. I mean, if you had the money in that case to go to the High Court judge, he would take a decision.
Okay.
It might be the right decision, or the wrong decision. That is the law of the land, and nobody really, except the headbangers in the press, object to it. And all that I'm doing is saying we need a simple system with an adjudicator because it has to be free of charge. It won't be as good as a High Court judge because he won't be as clever and he won't have brilliant lawyers on either side arguing the case. But better justice that's a bit rough and ready than no justice at all, because at the moment the man can't go to court.
But it's a mandatory system that everyone will have access to.
Yes, because I think that observing the law of the land and in the press's own rules is fundamental. If you're not going to observe the law and your rules.
But Hugh, in your system it's not mandatory, it's voluntary. Is that right?
Yes, you don't have to be a member.
So if I'm this footballer in, let's pick at random, Workington, and I've been, these photos have been published by me in the Workington Times, which has a monopoly.
Not in the first division.
Which you've been at it.
It has, this local newspaper has, and I've got to put this question to Martin in a minute, it has a monopoly. So most people in Workington read it because there's nothing else to read in Workington, and it has an online website and everything. And this paper says to me, sorry, we just think, that's what people want to know about. And no, we don't belong to this ridiculous system, so go away. He has no recourse, no redress.
Well, at the moment, the position is that the only redress you have in that situation is the courts. I mean, you go to the... I'm not one of those who's satisfied with the way the PCC has resolved disputes over the past 20 years. I mean, the PCC deals with easy disputes. If there's a complex dispute, it ducks it because it's got no way of determining issues of fact. Has no hearings. The Press Council in the old days started them. The Press PCC has never had them. Now, in that situation, you have no remedy at all apart from going to court. Now, what I'm proposing is if the Workington Gazette, I hope that such a newspaper doesn't exist, I don't want to be rude about it. If the Workington Gazette is intrusive, I mean, actually not really a practical problem because it's not local newspapers that are causing these difficulties. But if it were, then under my system, the footballer would have enhanced remedies in the High Court. In other words, he would have support for access to justice through CFAs. There would be additional damages awarded, so the remedies will be stronger, like they are now, only stronger. So, of course, that's state intervention. The state has a duty under international law to provide a mechanism for resolving disputes. Yes, the situation is not is like the present situation, but slightly better for the victim.
Well, why not make it even better and do what Max says and put it on a statutory footing?
Well, I mean, what I agree with Max about many things, and this is quite a small area of dispute. I think the difficulty with, I'm afraid to say, I have experience of local solicitors up and down the country, and I'm afraid I would not want them resolving privacy disputes. I mean, what one has is what Max is suggesting is effectively a court system.